In a medieval kitchen, the year is 1400. A family is sitting down to eat a meal of salmon caught in a local river. Picture the crackling fire of the hearth, flickering light dancing on the stone walls. The family gathers around a wooden table, rough-hewn but sturdy, with plates of fish, dark rye bread, and a few simple vegetables, as they pass a mug of weak ale between themselves. Salmon were so abundant in that era they ran up virtually every single river in medieval Britain. A wild fish so plentiful it was considered peasant food. In some places such as Manchester, there were actual agreements to stop the apprentice boys being fed salmon more than 4 times a week. Salmon made huge runs in the great rivers of the Mersey and Irwell. A fish that today in Britain no one would even eat because there are none. Not enough to be sold, maybe 0.001% of what ran our rivers. Very few young people will have even have tasted the Atlantic salmon in its wild form from a river full of protein. A solid omega-3 profile around 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of EPA and DHA, both essential fats that our bodies cannot produce. Essential for brain function, reducing inflammation and keeping your heart healthy. Now, compare that to a supermarket farmed salmon that is fed on canthaxin to colour it, and being as white as a cod if it was not deliberately fed a red dye. Would you buy a pure white salmon portion? Fed vegetable protein instead of wild shrimp, fish, and other crustaceans, and treated with organophosphates such as azamethophos insecticide to kill sea lice which are decimating what is left of the wild populations of Atlantic salmon. The wild Atlantic salmon would run in the spring salmon often bigger fish, and then the second big run in the autumn. All through summer salmon grills a young type of salmon would run. Typically they only spent 1 season at sea. This would fill the stopgap. The church was harsh, demanding many meat-free days. Fridays were mandatory. The medieval system from kings, earls, knights and peasants would observe this. As much as 1/3 of their lives could be meat-free. It took a lot to go against the church. Henry VIII did it, but for different reasons. Once these huge runs were harvested, they could be eaten fresh, salted, smoked or salted and smoked that would keep then for a few months. Salmon is an oily fish, so eventually its oils would go rancid, giving it a stale off taste. These fish would be caught in nets woven from hemp or even retted nettle fibres. Nettles even made a cottage industry, weaving its sturdy fibres into sacks or fishing nets that then could be oiled or treated with tar to preserve them. Artificial weirs were created, fish traps as well, driving hazel or willow stakes into the ground. To create one-way funnels, medieval fish traps are still unearthed today in Britain. The Scottish estuaries and big English rivers constantly show this. Woven baskets called putchers that let salmon and fish in but not out. The remains of these are still unearthed by archaeologists, fishermen and wildfowlers. Until recently, people still fished for salmon in places like the Severn estuary. They caught salmon in giant triangular handheld nets called lave nets. They still keep the tradition alive today. But they aren't allowed to keep the salmon. In Scotland, these similar nets are called half nets. This tradition dates back to the Vikings. As well as salmon, there were eels. These were common in rivers and even ponds. They were often caught in nets or lines, baited with a worm or a small dead fish on a hook. Under a full moon at a specific time, eels would turn silver and swim down ditches and out of ponds and down into rivers to start their migration to the Sargasso Sea. These fish were caught and smoked or salted. Even today, a smoked eel is regarded by some as the finest fish meal on the planet. In parts of Scandinavia, it is revered. Other sea fish, now long gone, decimated, or on the endangered list, would run the medieval British rivers. Lamprey, a parasitic fish that attaches itself to other fish by use of a specialised mouthpiece sucker, were considered a prized delicacy. Rich, oily and bloody, they were eaten at royal banquets. And
Bring
by the
lamprey
nobility,
pie!
at certain
Let no
times
man
British
go without!
rivers were full of them. They came with a catch. They could
To His
carry
Majesty,
parasites. They went
and to
off
the
quickly
finest
and were
pie
often
in all the
loaded with
kingdom.
bacteria. King Henry I died after eating a lamprey pie at a royal banquet. It is suspected that he suffered a serious case of food poisoning. Shad, both Alice and Thwaite ran certain rivers, noticeably the Severn and Severn estuary. These were in the herring family. Their runs were massive until very recently. They were caught, eaten fresh, or smoked and salted. The sparling was another similar fish with massive catches in Stranraer in Scotland. It smelled of cucumber and survived in Luce Bay up until the 1800s, where it too succumbed to overfishing along with the native British oyster, a local tradition. Historically, when the sparling run began, local communities would flock to riverbanks with buckets and nets to gather them for an annual tasty dinner treat. Commercial fishing. Commercial fleets targeted them heavily. For example, the River Forth supported a dedicated sparling fishing fleet until the 1970s. In the River Cree, records show nets bringing in up to 6 tons of fish, roughly 50,000 individual sparling, in a single year. The aristocratic delicacy. Beyond working-class tables, their unique cucumber scent and sweet flavour made them highly sought after by high society chefs and aristocrats across Victorian Britain. Because sparling are small and have incredibly soft bones, they were rarely filleted. Instead, they were cooked and eaten whole, including the head and tail. The most common traditional method was to gut them, toss them in flour or oatmeal, and fry them crisp in butter or bacon fat. They were also frequently pickled, smoked, or baked into fish pies. Can you eat them today? No, not in the UK. Due to their severe population collapse, sparling are now strictly protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981. It is illegal to intentionally catch, injure, or kill them in British waters. However, because the species, European smelt, is still abundant in other parts of the world, it remains a massive culinary tradition elsewhere. Germany, known as stint, they are coated in rye flour, fried with bacon, and celebrated at massive regional spring festivals. Russia and Eastern Europe. In St. Petersburg, the annual Koryushka Smelt Festival draws thousands of people to eat them fried or dried and salted as a beer snack. How they were cooked. In rivers non-migratory, fish were also caught and eaten. A pike was highly prized, a very bony fish with nasty Y-shaped bones. Certain techniques can be used to fillet the pike. Its preparation can be wasteful. One way is to completely macerate it and make fish cakes on its own, or mixed with medieval vegetables such as parsnips, turnips, or burdock. Burdock was grown and very common, still regarded in Asia and Japan. Tasty, full of carbohydrates, vitamins and minerals. Modern agriculture can't cope with a huge leafy vegetable with a taproot that is enormous and packed with fibre, carbs and goodness. Carp was a fish that the monasteries took to heart. It grew quickly in stock ponds and produced large, thick fillets of protein. Cistercian monks were masters of these. Stock ponds gave rise to the name stockfish. They were fed. Giant worked compost heaps contained any food waste. Human dung, animal dung and rotten apples. The peeled skin of fruit, vegetables and straw. They produced earthworms and redworm called the red wriggler a top fishing bait. However, this wasn't the reason. In this environment, The redworm multiplies. In months, it could be tens of thousands. In a giant 30-yard square compost heap, close to 1 million redworms. Anyone who has home composted garden clippings and windfall and apples will have seen this firsthand. The worm were fed to the fish by the bucket full. It was no hardship to catch several fish in these stock ponds. Often many ponds, long, deep and narrow, they could be caught with a baited worm or simply hand-netted with a landing net. Carp are still highly prized in Europe, eaten by the Poles on Christmas Day. Definitely not to the taste of the modern British palate. Other river fish were trout, dace, gudgeon. These were mild tasting. Barbel with its thick, firm flesh was eaten. It was often stewed to hide its flavour. It was strong tasting to say the least. Perch, common in ponds and rivers, was highly regarded and made it up until the Victorian ages, a firm favourite, very much like a saltwater bream.